Hey, welcome to the One Piece at a Time Distilling Institute with your host, the alchemist of Indiana's Black Forest, Alan Bishop. Hey, this channel is all about home distilling and legal distilling. If you've got questions, reach out to us in the comments below, social media, or via bishopshomegrown@gmail.com. And don't forget to check out thealchemistcabinet.com. Hey guys, little tasting video here this evening at the One Piece at a Time Distilling Institute. So, for those of you who follow my career at Spirits of French Lick, you know that we do things a little differently than most of the other distillers do, even other craft distillers. We sort of have four pillars, so and those pillars being bourbon, brandy, botanical spirits, and American whiskeys such as rye whiskey, single malt whiskey, etc. But brandy has always been very important to me, and as many of you know, I started off my career in the legal industry at Copper & King's American Brandy Company. Before that, I grew up as a moonshiner, and primarily, as I've talked about many times, both here on the One Piece at a Time Distilling Institute channel, as well as the Sacred and Profane podcast on Spotify, and in various podcasts, interviews, etc. The main thing that we did was apple brandy, peach brandy, pear brandy growing up, and a little bit of grape brandy. So I've obviously fulfilled my, I guess you'd say, almost obligations at Spirits of French Lick regarding Hoosier apple brandy, the Black Forest of Southern Indiana, the multiple varieties of Old Cliffy apple brandy that we have produced at Spirits of French Lick, plus complexity, which has matured completely in a tequila barrel, etc. And I had put off for a very long time releasing a aged grape brandy or a matured grape brandy. So this bottle we're about to talk about here is pretty special to me for multiple reasons. The first reason is because when I was at Copper & King's and did not necessarily get on with the owners and several of the staff, etc., and I got ready to leave to come back to Indiana, knowing the history of distilling in Indiana, including the fact that grape brandy was actually distilled here, particularly in Lawrence County, Indiana at the Daisy Spring Mill Distillery, which we are now rebuilding, and also over in Switzerland County, Indiana, where the Swiss Huguenots settled and were playing around with the Cape grape as well as the Catawba grape pretty prominently with both sparkling wine but also with brandy. There was a conversation that was had between me and the owner of Copper & King's. And now he may say that this was tough love. I'm not sure that I agree with that entirely. I'm not sure that anything that he did or said to me or to anyone else for that matter was ever tough love, just more him being a dick. Get along with him fine now because I don't have to work with him and I don't have to deal with him, but he knows how I feel. Anyways, he made it a point to constantly rub it in my face that I came from a moonshining background and to say things, along the lines of no one, and who gives a fuck about donkey shit grain and bourbon and this, that, and the other. And when I got ready to leave and I told him I was leaving, he made a very snide remark to me one time about how I was making a mistake to go work for a podunk distillery in the middle of nowhere. I knew it was a little distillery. I knew it was in the middle of nowhere. I knew the owners didn't necessarily know anything about the distilled spirits industry, but I knew what I was capable of and what I was planning on doing. And then he followed that up with, don't forget when you leave that none of this fucking stuff happened in Indiana. It happened in Kentucky. Fuck off. You and your Magic River. So it always stuck in my craw. And he put me under a non-compete that I couldn't produce brandy for a certain period of time. Would have never held up in court being in Indiana as opposed to Kentucky, but I respected it on the brandy side. Now, they tried to hit me with a non-compete for, pretty much every spirit in the fucking book, and I talked them down from that shit. I wouldn't have signed it anyways, and there's a story behind that that some of you may be familiar with about wiping my ass with a non-compete. But we don't need to go into all that. Nonetheless, when that non-compete was over for grape brandy, the first thing I did was I wanted to distill some Catawba brandy because I knew Catawba's history in southern Indiana. I knew that Catawba brandy is what really kicked off the commercial wine industry in the United States, or Catawba wine as it were. And I knew that I wanted to lean into that history pretty hard. So one of the very first early things that we released was a Catawba Eau de Vie, a Catawba Water of Life, a white version of Catawba. Catawba grapes are interesting. I'm still not sure. I've got to do some more research. I haven't researched them for a while, but for a long time it wasn't apparent what the parentage was, just that it was a European cross to an American wild grape. And that's very, very apparent when you smell and you taste Catawba. Catawba is very, very phenolic, very perfumey. And that's one of the reasons why I wanted to play with it, because one of my other favorite grapes of all time, and it's really a family of grapes, is the Muscat grape. So Muscat Alexander in particular is fantastic for distilling. It's very strong, very perfumey. It's picked at a higher pH. It's not allowed to completely ripen because you lose a lot of those aromatics, and Catawba has a lot in common with that when you're making brandy in particular. It's wonderful, as almost think of it in a brandy blend as being sort of the equivalent of a small grain in a bourbon, like a rye or a wheat, something is more of an accent note than anything else. And at Copper and Kings, we did a lot of Muscat in our blends with Chenin Blanc and Colombard as well. And they all brought something unique and different to the table. But by far the most wild of all those grapes was Muscat. And we even focused our absinthe program on Muscat, although some of the more interesting absinthes we did with, say, ginger or lavender or citrus, those were actually using Colombard to kind of tone that base alcohol down just a little bit. So I figured that Catawba must have some similarity when distilled to Muscat, although I'd never done it before, and so I saw the opportunity to do it at Spirits of French Lick. Now, when I first proposed it, I got fucking scoffed at and laughed at and told that it was too expensive and that, you know, we weren't going to do it because we're not a brandy distillery. Well, that's because you don't understand who you just hired as a distiller, and over time I was able to fight for my right to do that, fight for my right to party, as the Beastie Boys say, so to speak. But finally talked ownership into it. We did the Eau de Vie. Eau de Vie is a hard sell in the United States, in the Midwest. Nobody knows what the hell it is. They don't know what it means. They don't know how to use it. They don't understand to use it in place of vodka, etc. And of course, Catawba is always going to be big, heavy, perfumey, oily on the palate, right? And so as a white spirit, Midwesterners are just fucking confused by it. So time went on and we had barreled some of that stuff. And I do have some barrels now that I think are 6, coming up on 7 years old. And I could have released those, but I wanted to hold on to those for something special in the future for Spirits of French Lick. Whether or not I'm there at the time that those barrels get released, because you never know, opportunities come along, etc. I may end up somewhere else. You never do know. But I wanted those barrels to have their place in the future, particularly as sort of an anniversary barrel, maybe as 10 or 12-year-old products, right? They are in French oak barrels, 1 toasted and 1 charred, which were originally Master Venter barrels that the winery had bought years and years ago and let basically fall apart. They originally actually had grapevines holding them together instead of regular iron rings, which is pretty cool in my opinion. I got those recouped and I did the first batch in that. Now, what we've got here in this bottle is actually the second batch of Catawba Brandy that I did as a bottled and bond, because there was another Southern Indiana distillery that did a Catawba Brandy as a young spirit, and they didn't take it to bottled and bond, and I thought, well, if we're going to do it, we'll make it match the rest of the family and we'll go bottled and bond. Now, before I get too far into the tasting notes or anything like that, I also want to talk about this artwork, which Brooklyn Leary got this all put together by her tattoo artist, Scotty Tedrow, at Fox and Crow. You can actually see the information about that on the side of the bottle. This will be in limited distribution by special order in the state of Indiana, but nowhere else as far as I know. And you can get it only otherwise at the tasting room at Spirits of French Lick. There's not a lot of it. There were 2 barrels. These were both French oak barrels as well. It is 4 years old, bottled and bond, 100 proof, and named after Dionysus. Now that's important to me because some of you know that I'm very into the esoteric, the occult, the paranormal, mythology, etc. But the very earliest figure I can remember getting interested in was the dying and rising god Dionysus. Lots and lots of parallels, of course, to Jesus Christ, with the dying and resurrection, the connection with wine and festivity, being able to turn water into wine, but also connections in history to the art of distillation as a way of praising Dionysus, not necessarily as a way of imbibing this of the spirit itself, but the term baptism by fire, for those of you who are interested in it, you'll read that in both of my books, both of my Alchemist Cabinet books. If you're interested in that story and a little bit more in depth on it, I am working on a podcast currently about the superstitions and the esoteric leanings of distillation that will be on the If You Have Ghosts, You Have Everything podcast in the coming weeks. But from the earliest days, I remember being very interested in Greek mythology and specifically this figure of Dionysus, a figure who historically wasn't even Greek. He was Thessian and adopted by the Greeks. He's representative of the green man, the renewal cycle, the death and birth of the year, descended into the underworld, into the abyss to save his mother from Hades, and bring her back, emerging from the abyss, as it were, as almost the sun, almost Apollo-like, and bringing spring and fertility back into the equation. A veritable baptism, as it were. He was torn apart by the Titans as a child. Zeus saved him, put him back together, sewed him into his thigh, and gave him new birth and new life. A very, very interesting character nonetheless. So I tried to include as much of that into, obviously, the spirit quality itself as what I could, but also into the history of what we're doing with this bottle, with that traditional Indiana brandy distillation tradition that we had here in Switzerland County and Lawrence County in particular with grape brandy. So on the back of it, it says this bottled and bond brandy is derived from Catawba grapes, the most widely grown varietal in the U.S. until the 1860s. Our modern commercial wine industry grew out of sparkling wine and brandy traditions established by Swiss Huguenot immigrants in Indiana. Named for the Greek god of fertility and wine, who was thought to be resurrected by distilling new wine into brandy, Dionysus symbolizes the rebirth of Indiana's grape brandy traditions. And then I had him switch out the respect the grain motto to respect the fruit. So as you can see, again, pretty special. And I'll make this tasting pretty short. Now again, bear in mind, I have older stocks of this set back in specialty barrels for the future. Hopefully at 10 or 12 years old. Whoever's in charge then, if it's me, bear that in mind. If it's somebody else, hold their feet to the fire. So, drinking out of my Whiskey Witch Nation glass here. Let's go to the nose. It is so straight line, just Catawba as it appears in the vineyard on the nose. I mean, that perfumey, round, and I don't even know how to put my tasting notes to I don't know how to do it justice. Almost like ripe melon, like not so much muskmelon, but maybe honeydew, maybe even a little passion fruit sort of characteristic on the nose, but very, very big on the nose. Not something that you're going to set down and probably drink of its own accord and drink quite a bit of it at one point in time. I will tell you that right now. It's probably a little heavy for that. Although I could see with a good cigar in particular that this would maybe work out well. I think those of you who are into like cigar blend stuff, I think you might like and understand this in particular. Maybe especially with a pretty heavy cigar, I think would work out pretty well. But there's also that beautiful French oak spice characteristic at the background with just a little vanilla and a little nutmeg. Make no mistake about it. This is an American brandy. This is not a fucking cognac. This is not an Armagnac. This is fruit forward. The emphasis here is on the fruit, with the barrel being there to back that up. The barrel was there to knock off the rough edges and to add some finesse to it overall. For 100 proof, it's not terribly hot at all. Most fruit brandies aren't bottled at 100 proof, or most grape brandies are not bottled at 100 proof. They're usually in the 80-86 range, into the 90s sometimes. Beautiful, spicy French oak on the palate with that big fruit pop at the front. At the very finish, that French oak just covers the palate. Nice oil slick sort of thing. Spiciness at the sides, at the back. The finish, the exhale, is just that aroma of those beautiful Catawba grapes. This is pretty special, and I'm going to tell you right now, get these flies off my camera here, it did happen in Indiana, motherfucker, and I did it, and you can kiss my ass. I have waited for fucking 7 years to be able to say that about a grape brandy. Now, is it going to be everybody's style of grape brandy? No, it's not. It's not meant to be. Is it going to be something you're going to sit down and drink a lot of in one run? Probably not, although I could see some interesting split cocktails, maybe with some rye whiskey with this in particular, or even blending a little bit of this and rye together and drinking it in the glass. I think that'd be just fine. I can see some interesting meal pairings with it in particular, but I will tell you where this is really going to shine. 2 places. First of all, this is going to shine after a meal, almost like a dessert wine, right? Have this instead of whatever dessert you're planning on. I think you'll appreciate it. Secondarily, coming up on the holiday season, this comes out on September the 1st, I believe, in the tasting room. That beautiful French oak and that Catawba on there, man. Make some eggnog with that. Now I know there's a bunch of brandy purists out there that's going to piss off, but I don't really care because I'm pretty agnostic about the way that anyone chooses to drink their spirits. So overall though, guys, cheers. I'm happy as hell. One other thing I should mention in here. Catawba, much like Muscat, does have a little vegetal sort of characteristic to it. It's not a flaw in the spirit at all, and it actually adds to the mouthfeel. But don't be surprised if you don't get some savory and some unctuousness middle of the back palate, right before the back palate and right before the finish. And all it does is make you appreciate that beautiful big nose and that beautiful aroma and that fruit pop on the entry, guys. Appreciate you watching. Love you. Later.